Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to do a final review of the Anbernic RG40XX H. Now I just did a very in-depth video about this device a while back, but I was calling that a 90% review at the time, and that's because there were things I wanted to test on it still, but then also I didn't know the price yet, and I do now. It's $70 plus shipping, which I think is pretty reasonable. So in this video we'll go over some of the things that I didn't get to test previously, for example the HDMI functionality, and then also I want to try out a custom firmware that is now working. In addition, I want to frame this video a little bit differently. We're going to look at 4 major use cases, and hopefully you'll fit into one of those 4, and that'll help you decide whether or not this device is a good fit for you, or there might be something else out there on the market which might be a little bit better. As you probably already know, when it comes to these retro handhelds, there are a ton of different options out there, and that's a good and a bad thing. It's good because there are lots of different choices, so you might find one that exactly fits your needs, but it can also be a bad thing because there are so many different options out there that it makes it a little bit hard to figure out which one's going to be the best for you. Either way, I'm hoping this video will help narrow it down, and so without any further delay, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's start by introducing our 4 different use cases right here. And these are all going to be based on drawings that my son made for me a couple years ago. I've used them in previous videos, and I think it's time to bring them back. And I'm hoping that the 4 different categories that they represent are going to reflect on you as well, considering the fact that you are watching this video about a retro handheld. And the names we're going to use today are going to be Megan and Clyde and Jackie and Toby. And we'll go through each of their concerns one at a time. But before we start with that, I did want to mention that there are 2 other use cases that we're not going to cover in this video. And these here are Ted and Fred. And Ted likes clamshells and Fred likes vertical handhelds. And I think that these 2 form factors don't really come into play when we're talking about this video in particular, because we're going to be focusing on horizontally based handhelds instead. And so for Ted, who prefers clamshells, it's an easy answer. Just get the RG35XX SP because that's basically the only one available right now with this kind of power and form factor. It's a similar story with Fred over here on the right. If he wants a vertical handheld, I would recommend the Miu Mini Plus or the RG35XX Plus, which you can see right here. So let's do a deep dive into our first use case. We're going to go back to Megan. Now Megan is on the hunt for her very first handheld. Maybe she's watched a few videos or she got a recommendation from one of her friends, but now she's ready to pull the trigger. And because the Anbernic RG40XX H is the newest available on the market, she figures this one's probably the best. So we're going to take this one from a first-time buyer's perspective. In addition, there are a couple different things that Megan is looking for in particular. The first is that she wants something that she can mostly use to focus on retro games. And because the RG40XX H has a nice big 4-inch screen, she thinks this might be a good fit. She's also looking for a handheld that's going to be very portable, something she can maybe throw in her pocket or in a bag and take around with her very easily. And because this is her first handheld, other than the Game Boy she played as a kid, there's a couple other things she has questions about. For example, what makes a good D-pad? And what are the other perks that she can get from emulating retro games? And she also doesn't know what it's like to actually use one of these. In terms of the operating system, is she supposed to use something called custom firmware? She's not really sure. And so we'll cover all those things in this section, including things like battery life as well as some charging recommendations. Okay, to start, the first thing that really drew her to this handheld was that she heard it had a bigger screen. It's supposed to be 4 inches, whereas the other ones have a 3.5-inch screen. And even though it doesn't sound like much, that half-inch difference between the two is about a 30% size difference with a 4x3 screen. Now, most typical 3.5-inch devices also have a 480p resolution like the one that we're reviewing today, and so there's not going to be any change in the actual resolution and scaling and stuff like that, but it is going to make all the games look a little bit more impressive and all the text a little bit easier to read, and I don't think that should be discounted. Now, in terms of things like contrast and saturation and color balance, I think that the 40XX H has an excellent display. The colors appear to be rich and vibrant, and I don't see any issues in terms of the color balance either. And so in terms of just general screen quality, I would put it about on par as the 3.5-inch devices from Anbernic, if not a little bit better when it comes to saturation. Now, in terms of dimness and brightness, I did find that at the lowest setting, it gets pretty dim, but not like super dim. I think this is something you could play in a late evening, but you probably wouldn't want to play it in a pitch black environment. It would probably be a little bit too bright. In general, I would classify this as being a pretty bright screen. At its max brightness, it is impressively bright. For example, here I am in a car, and it's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and you can see here that at the brightest setting, it is still very rich and clear. On a similar note, here's me on my studio balcony at about 3 o'clock o'clock in the afternoon. And this is under cover, so there is some shade going on, but yeah, still looks really good. Now, if we angle it so that we can see actual reflections against the sky, you can see that, yeah, it gets a lot harder to read, but still, I would say this is at least playable. I wouldn't want to play through an entire game like this, but I think that you can get through a few minutes here and there. So in a nutshell, I would say this is a device that gets bright enough to be able to use outdoors, but maybe not in direct sunlight. So just make sure that you're in the shade and you'll be good to go. So I think in Megan's case, where she's just looking for a good screen to be able to play retro games on, then I think that the 40XX H is going to be good without breaking the bank. Next, I want to talk about D-pad, and I mentioned it in my previous video, but I do find this D-pad to be pretty good, but a little bit overly sensitive. And after about a week or so of testing, I've kind of figured out what's going on with this D-pad, and I think it's two different things that give me this feeling. The first is that the design of this D-pad seems to be a little bit different than previous devices like the RG35XX H. It's slightly smaller by like 0.5 millimeter, so not a big difference there, but it's more rounded around the edges as you can see in this comparison. The next thing I noticed is that it seems like the rubber membrane underneath the D-pad is a little bit softer than usual. And I think as a result, the D-pad is a little bit more recessed into the shell compared to previous models. And so overall, I've just had a softer experience with this D-pad, both in terms of the shape and size of the D-pad, but then also the rubber membrane below. Now, the RG35XX H has a stiffer rubber membrane, which makes the D-pad just feel snappier overall. And this allows me to pass the D-pad contra test with this device, where I press down and then move it left and right. It will make the character move if I press it hard enough, but when I just kind of wiggle it back and forth, it does stay in place, and so this is ideal for me. By contrast, because we have a softer D-pad experience with the RG40XX H, it does not pass that contra test. Instead, as soon as you start to waggle it back and forth, it just starts to move the character, and so this means that you're going to get things like accidental diagonals. And so my overall experience over the past week or so of testing has been that this is mostly a soft and a loose pivot when it comes to this D-pad. I think many people are not going to notice it or even care, but I think for those who really want to make sure they get the most precise inputs, this won't be a great fit. Now, another thing about the controls that I mentioned in my previous video is the fact that the analog sticks stick out a little bit more than previous models. They're using the same style sticks, but the housing itself is just a little bit more elevated. And I would say this is a double-edged sword. When playing with analog stick-centric games, it does give you a little bit extra control, but because the sticks protrude so much, you are going to press down on them from time to time, even when you don't want to. The way I've been thinking about it is that this is definitely a D-pad centric device. That's the most natural place to put your thumbs. But as you use that D-pad and the face buttons, your thumbs are going to rest upon those analog sticks. And it's not something that I found particularly annoying, but something that was just a casual reminder all the time that you had those sticks there. And given the fact that Megan in our example is mostly going to be focusing on retro games, this may not be a welcome thing. And so just in terms of overall hand feel, I think that the RG35XX H is a little bit better. Not only is the D-pad a little bit more snappy and premium feeling, but those analog sticks aren't going to get in the way as much when you're using it for D-pad centric gaming. And so between these two models, I don't think it's very clear cut. Yes, the screen is definitely better on the 40XX H, and the bigger screen does make the device slightly larger, which makes it more comfortable in the hand. However, when we're getting down to brass tacks and actually playing games, I think that the 35XX H just has better controls overall. Now let's assume that Megan is still considering the 40XX H, so let's walk through a couple other features she may be interested in. The first is that this device is capable of Wi-Fi, which means that she'll be able to turn on retro achievements. This is a setting within RetroArch, and once you've signed up for an account and put in your credentials, you'll now be able to start earning achievements for all your retro games. And so this is definitely one of the perks of having a device like this that is Wi-Fi capable, and it's a lot of fun. And down below, I'm going to leave a link to my starter guide for this device and other devices like it, which will allow you to set up things like retro achievements and learn a little bit more about the whole setup process. Now, another thing that Megan might be interested in is battery life, and this battery is actually a little bit smaller than other devices. It's 3200 milliamp hours. Other Anbernic devices using the same chipset like the 35XX H as well as the 35XX SP both use 3,300 milliamp hours, so there's a 100 milliamp hour difference. When it comes down to it, I would say that's a relatively small difference, and so I'm not terribly concerned about the size of the battery itself, but I still did a bunch of battery testing just to be sure. And the main concern here is that because the screen is 30% larger and it has RGB lighting on the sticks, it might reduce the battery life by a bunch. And I found that the average battery life that I got for this device was around 5 hours. If I tried to push it with more heavyweight games, things like Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast, I would usually get somewhere around 4 hours, but then if I tried to play something really lightweight, like a Game Boy game, then that would actually last about 8 hours. So I'm going to say 5 to 6 hours is the average, depending on the variety of games that you're playing. For something like Game Boy Advance or Super Nintendo, the average of about 5 hours is just about perfect. Now let's briefly talk about charging, and I would recommend using a USB-C to USB-A cable. And in the box, you will get a cable like this. Now in terms of charging brick, I recommend using something very low powered. I typically will either plug it into my PC to make sure it gets the correct wattage, or I will plug it into something like a power strip that already has these power plugs inside. Over the years, I've seen a lot of people that have issues with charging, and it usually will come down to the fact that they're trying to use a high-powered charging brick, something with power delivery, and often these devices, especially these from Anbernic, are not able to handle that. And so my recommendation is to use a low-powered brick, something like from an old phone, and also keep an eye on your device while you're charging it just to be safe. Moving on, I also wanted to talk a little bit more about pocketability, because even though I did demonstrate this in my previous video, I also did an experiment. There was one day in particular where I actually put the device in my pocket and then walked around with it all day while running errands. And even though this device is a little bit larger than those that have a 3.5-inch screen, I still found this to be a very pleasant experience. Now bear in mind, I was wearing shorts like this, and so I had pretty big pockets. But even then, I would say the experiment was a success. I could throw it in my pocket, take it around all day, pull it out when I needed, and play it for a few minutes at a time. It was a pretty great experience. And so if portability is a concern for Megan, or maybe for you, I still think it's going to be a pretty good fit. And finally, last thing I wanted to talk about in this section is just the overall stock software experience. So this is what it's going to be like right when you boot the device up with no tinkering whatsoever. And I've gone into detail about this in that previous video, but essentially I would say that this software is good enough. It's going to allow you to navigate through the various systems and then start up your game, and it's pretty easy to close out of them as well. The only extra work I would recommend considering is that you may want to add your own game files, and that's because even though there are games already preloaded on this card, it's not going to have every single one, and so maybe some of your childhood favorites will need to be added manually. It's a very easy process, you just have to drag and drop them onto your SD card. And finally, one last note is that this device does have RGB lighting around the sticks, which you can totally turn off if you don't want to see it, but that might be a draw for you as well. So putting it all together for Megan, someone who's looking into buying their very first handheld and they want to focus on retro systems, I think there's a lot of reasons why, yes, this might be a good fit. It's really going to come down to priorities with this device, whether or not you want to have a larger screen, or whether or not you're most interested in having pitch-perfect controls. But when all is said and done, I think for a first-time purchase, this is a pretty darn good handheld, especially compared to like the first one I bought, 4 or 5 years ago. Okay, so now let's move on to another person. We're going to talk about Clyde. Now, Clyde is a little bit different. They are also interested in getting their very first handheld, but they are more of a tinkerer at heart. For example, maybe Clyde has a background in the IT world, and so he doesn't mind tinkering around and getting his hands dirty. And so as a result, Clyde's needs are a little bit different than Megan's. He is looking for his very first handheld. He wants something that will at least apply to him in terms of retro gaming, but he's also interested in jumping into that world of custom firmware and settings configurations, and maybe also consoleizing the device, like plugging it into a TV with a Bluetooth controller, things like that. So let's go over some of the reasons why Clyde may also be interested in this device. To start, in my previous video, I showed that out of the box, when I tried to use any other custom firmware card, it did not work with the device. And this likely has to do something with this screen, since it's different than the others, and so that's probably causing the issue. Well, since making the last video, I was able to figure out that if I took the stock card from this device and then added MinUI and installed it on top of it, it would work. And so already I do have one custom firmware working, and it's actually pretty great. I also went through and made a bunch of modifications to MinUI to allow me to use this interface to navigate through the system, but to still launch all the stock RetroArch cores instead of the MinUI cores. And this opens up the experience for other systems, including things like Dreamcast and Nintendo 64, as well as standalone emulators, including PlayStation Portable and even Pico 8. And so for the past week or so, this is the interface that I've been using. It has a MinUI front end, but I'm really just kind of using the stock operating system underneath. And I've gone ahead and compiled all of this experience into a package for you. And so if you end up picking up this device or any other device that uses the same chipset, you should be able to use this setup. I'm calling it Abomination UI because I'm just kind of hijacking MinUI to make it fit my needs. And I'll have a link for it down below. It's a pretty easy process. You just install MinUI and then you throw this on top of it. Either way, I think it's pretty awesome that we're able to get custom firmware working on a device even as it starts to launch. I think it's a testament to all the custom firmware firmware work that's been happening on other devices using the same chip. This is one of the benefits of having devices that release with the same chip over and over. And so already when we're talking about Clyde's perspective of wanting to be able to tinker around with this device, I'm already seeing that yes, this is definitely possible because I did it myself. In addition, I got confirmation from the MuOS development team that they are also working on a port of their firmware for this device as well. In fact, they expect to have a test version of that firmware available in the next few days. And so in a couple weeks, I think we'll be in a much better place where MuOS will likely be available for this device. And the user experience here is very good. There's a lot of robust development for this operating system right now. And so not only is the interface really good, it also has Portmaster and some pretty great performance for the high-end systems as well. Another operating system that is really great with this chipset is called Newly. This is a port of Batocera. I did a whole setup for it in my previous starter guide. And the team is also working on a port of this firmware for the 40XX H as well. And so I do expect us to be able to use Newly on the 40XX H sometime in the future. And this is also great because Newly uses an emulation station front end, which makes it one of the prettiest operating systems that you can use for this chipset right now. And so because Clyde is looking forward to trying out different custom firmwares on this new device, then yes, I think that the 40XX H shows a lot of promise. Now, the other thing he was interested in was checking out whether or not he could consoleize the device by plugging it in via HDMI and using Bluetooth. And I also tested this out, and the stock operating system process is exactly the same as it is on other devices. It uses a mini HDMI connection, which means you'll need a special adapter or a special cable. But after that, once you plug it in, yeah, everything's going to work and it'll scale nicely in the menus. Now, when you try to play the actual game, it is going to blow it up to full screen, which means you'll have to go into the RetroArch settings and adjust the aspect ratio. I also went into detail about this in my starter guide, so we're not going to spend too much time on it. Either way, this is a confirmation that yes, it does work exactly as intended. And same thing with Bluetooth controllers. You can set it up within the settings, and then after that, yeah, you'll be able to navigate through the menus no problem with an additional controller. Of note, the Bluetooth controller is going to automatically go to player 2. So that's going to be fine if you're playing with a multiplayer setup, but if you're trying to consoleize it, you will have to go in and adjust the controls. And again, all that stuff is covered in the starter guide. So as a whole, I would say that yes, you can consoleize this handheld like with the others with the same chipset. So when it comes to Clyde's case and the fact that he wants to tinker around, he wants to consoleize the device, then yes, he can do that, provided that he's good with all the other things that we talked about with Megan previously, and the fact that the controls aren't perfect, but the screen is definitely nice. So in Clyde's case, I would say that yeah, this is probably going to be worth picking up as a first-time handheld. Okay, next up we have Jackie. Now Jackie is not a first-time handheld buyer. She bought a device a couple years ago. It's pretty low powered, but it can play up to like PS1 and maybe a little bit of Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast. And she's looking to upgrade. It's been a while and maybe she just thinks it's time to try something new. But one thing to consider is that Jackie's a little bit on the younger side, especially compared to old folks like me. Her childhood systems were the Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast, so those are the systems she wants to play the most. And so in particular, she's looking for a device that can play Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast and maybe a little PSP and Saturn as well. And I would say from a performance standpoint, the RG40XX H is probably not going to be a good fit for her. And that's because you have to consider that this is a budget-oriented device. After all, it's $70 plus shipping. And as much as I'd love to be able to say that, yeah, at that price point you can play PS2, that's just not really possible right now. Instead, the performance here is going to be much like with other handhelds we've seen over the past few years. It'll play up through PS1 with basically no problem, but when it comes to Dreamcast and Nintendo 64, most games will play fine, but it's going to come with some concessions. In the case of Dreamcast, the emulator is going to run with an auto frame skip on, so it's not going to be a perfect 60 frames per second. Most of these games I would consider to be playable, but I wouldn't think of it as an elevated experience. And it's very similar with Nintendo 64. There are plenty of games that play just fine, but this one doesn't take advantage of auto frame skip. Instead, you'll have to contend with some slowdowns and some audio crackling here and there as you start to play more heavyweight games. And so in particular with Jackie, who's maybe a little bit more picky about her Dreamcast and Nintendo 64 emulation, this device is probably not going to be a great fit from the performance standpoint. Not only that, those two systems rely a lot on analog sticks, and the analog sticks on this device are nothing to write home about. As I showed in my previous video, these have a lot of cardinal snapping to them. They will basically snap to different 8-way directions as opposed to a full analog input. And so not only will the performance be compromised, but also the control input will as well. Now another factor that's unique to this handheld is that it gets rather warm on one side in particular when you start to push it with systems like Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast. And the heat is mostly going to be centered around the right side of the device or the left when we're looking at the back. And that's because the CPU is directly under that space. It's a little to the side of the battery, and because there's no cooling here, as the chip starts to heat up, it's going to push it into the back of the shell. They do have a little bit of insulation on the back shell, but it doesn't seem to really reduce the heat at all. Not only that, the texture of the plastic is a little bit on the slick side compared to other devices from Anbernic. And when you combine that with the heat of it, it does make it a little bit slippery, especially on this back side. In fact, here you can see that there are marks on the device from just the sweat that would accumulate on my fingers as I was playing it. Now, I wouldn't consider this to be uncomfortably hot, but it is definitely something that I would say is noticeably warm. And given the fact that I live in a warm climate here in Hawaii, it is something that is just a little bit less pleasant than I would like. So this is a factor that I would not consider to be a deal breaker, but if you are sensitive to having warmth in your hands like this, then it might not be a good fit for you. For my part, I've mostly been focusing just on Super Nintendo and below. That makes it so that the device doesn't get as warm, but then also I obviously won't have any performance issues either. And so when it comes to classic gaming, I think this is a better fit. And if Jackie is really concerned about having excellent performance with Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast, then I have a couple other recommendations which might be a better fit. The first is going to be the Retroid Pocket 2S. This device has been around for quite some time now, but it is fairly powerful. This is an Android-based device and is able to play through Dreamcast and Nintendo 64 with absolutely no problem. In fact, it's powerful enough to be able to play through quite a few 3DS, GameCube, and PS2 games as well. Now, the Retroid Pocket 2S is a little bit thicker than the 40XX H, and that mostly has to do with the fact that these triggers stick out a little bit more. However, I would say these triggers are quite a bit better because they have an analog input to them, which is going to be great for systems like Dreamcast and even GameCube. Not only that, the analog sticks on the Retroid Pocket 2S are phenomenal. It's the same kind of sticks we've seen in a lot more expensive devices. So I would say if Jackie is in the market for a small and portable device that's going to be able to play through her favorite systems, then this is probably going to be a better fit. It's a little bit more expensive. It starts at $99 plus shipping, but I think that that increase in price is well worth it for the performance that you're going to get. Just bear in mind that it does have a 3.5-inch screen, so it's going to be a little bit smaller than the 40XX in that regard. If she's looking to get a bigger screen with still excellent performance, then there's a couple other things I would consider. The first is going to be the Anbernic RG4005M. This one is also an Android-based device, but uses a chipset that's a little bit more powerful than the one we were just looking at. In fact, these two devices are very similar when you look at them side by side. The design around the menu and the start and select buttons is very similar, and even the face buttons are pretty close too. And of course, they both have that same 4-inch 480p 4:3 aspect ratio screen. Now, there are some differences. For example, the 405M has inline shoulder buttons, which makes it a lot more pocketable, but not quite as comfortable as something like the 40XX H. In addition, the D-pad is down below on the 405M, and that's probably because it's more focused on analog stick-centric gaming, you know, things like Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, and because it's more powerful, you can play about half of the catalogs when it comes to GameCube and PS2 and even 3DS. But just bear in mind that the performance will not be perfect with those really high-end systems. You'll have to do things like emulation hacks and stuff like that. Either way, even though the RG405M is a relatively old device, I still think it stood the test of time. And if Jackie is looking for something that's powerful and pocketable at around $150, this might be worth it. However, the last recommendation I'm going to give for Jackie is this device, the RG Cube, which is a more recent release. This one has a 4-inch screen that's actually a square aspect ratio, but it's got a lot more power than the others, and so this will play almost every GameCube and PS2 game relatively well. And I would say that this device is still relatively portable too. It's a little bit thicker, so I wouldn't want to throw it in my pocket, but yeah, it's still a nice compact design that's very comfortable. And so Jackie, if you're watching this video, I would say that you probably aren't going to want to get the RG40XX H. After all, the performance here is about the same as it's been on other devices released over the past couple years. Instead, I think it's worth it to check out some of the more powerful systems, even though they will cost a little bit more. And of course, all the devices that I'm showcasing in this video have full reviews on this channel as well. So long story short, Jackie, I don't think you're gonna be happy with this one. Let's move on to the next contender. So next up we have Toby, and man, Toby is a handful. He considers retro handhelds to be his hobby, not necessarily the retro gaming itself, but the handhelds and the collecting of them. And you've probably run into someone like him before. For example, if you've ever left a comment on Reddit talking about the handheld that you own and how much you like it, he's the one that comes in immediately afterwards and tells you that he got a TrimUI Smart Pro for $35 on Temu, and as a result, your device is terrible and his is much better. And so Toby is a little bit difficult to deal with because he's got a lot of opinions, even if he may not own every single device. But let's say in this case in particular, he has a couple other devices that are very similar to the 40XX H, and he's considering whether or not he should pick this one up. For example, let's assume that he does own an Anbernic RG35XX H, because at the time of its release, it was definitely the best budget horizontal handheld you could find. But now he's thinking, well, maybe I should have waited and got the 40XX H instead. After all, this one has a larger screen and a little bit more comfy controls, and so this might be a better fit. And so what he's really concerned about is whether or not one is better than the other. However, as I've demonstrated in this video, it's not quite as cut and clear. The screen is definitely improved, and I think that it's more ergonomic and comfortable to use, but overall I would say the controls are better on the RG35XX H just because the D-pad's a little bit snappier and the analog sticks don't quite get in the way. So as far as whether or not it's worth picking up an entirely new device to upgrade to a better screen, that's really going to be up to Toby. Now, another device that a lot of people are comparing the 40XX H to is the TrimUI Smart Pro. And I think it's a valid comparison given the fact that they have a similar form factor, although the TrimUI Smart Pro has a 16:9 display. And there are a lot of good things going with the TrimUI Smart Pro, and I think a lot of people are wondering whether or not one is better than the other, especially because the TrimUI Smart Pro is a little bit cheaper right now. Well, when it comes to 4x3 content in particular, you might be surprised to find that the TrimUI Smart Pro actually has a larger screen. When displaying 4x3 content, the screen itself is 4.1 inches as opposed to 4, so it's a little bit bigger. Not only that, this screen has 720 vertical pixels, which means that you'll have more options when it comes to scaling. So provided that you don't mind having a larger device with black borders on the left and right, then sure, when it comes to 4x3 content, the TrimUI Smart Pro is still pretty good. But I think where it really shines is when it comes to wider systems. Game Boy Advance is a great example. Because the TrimUI Smart has a wider aspect ratio, that means that the display is going to be larger and it's just going to look a lot better. Same thing with full widescreen 16:9 games, including, widescreen ports as well as things like PSP or widescreen hacks for Dreamcast and Nintendo 64. And even though I don't really like these sticks on the TrimUI Smart Pro, they're like PS Vita style sticks that are a little bit small and flicky, they still have much better precise input compared to the 40XX H. So when it comes to playing something like Super Mario 64, I would much rather play it on the TrimUI Smart Pro compared to the other. So for someone like Toby, who already owns very similar devices to the 40XX, including the TrimUI Smart Pro or even the 35XX H, I don't see the 40XX H as being a large enough upgrade to justify that additional price. The only way I can see it being a valid purchase in this one regard is whether or not the person wants to have a larger screen but also doesn't want to have black borders on each side. In that one specific use case, then yeah, I could see the 40XX H being justified in that purchase. But I think for the most part, Toby is probably not going to fill that empty void in his heart by buying the 40XX H. It's just so similar to other devices that have been released over the past several months. Instead, he might be better off saving up his money to see whether or not Anbernic or a different company is able to come up with something that's a little bit better of a fit or at least worth that upgrade. Okay, so now that we've gone through all those different use cases and kind of figured out where it's going to be the best fit for certain people, let's actually start wrapping it up and kind of summarize whether or not I think this handheld is worth picking up in the first place. And I think if I was to put it in just the most reductive terms, I could say that yes, this is an excellent handheld for the price, and it is one that I could recommend, especially if it's your very first handheld on the market. If we want to go another step further, if you're specifically looking for retro style games and playing them in a 4:3 aspect ratio, I think this is going to be an excellent fit, and I think that 4-inch screen does push it a little bit above some others just because things are just a little bit more bigger and brighter and more vibrant and just easier to read the text, and I do appreciate that. And I also appreciate the fact that you have all of that packed into a device that I would consider to be pocketable. And so if we're just looking at this handheld, weighing the good and the bad that I mentioned in my previous video, yes, I think that there are more good than bad, and it is a device I can recommend. However, I have a couple little asterisks I want to put at the end of that recommendation. The first is that I don't recommend this device if you already have something very similar already, like the RG35XX H or maybe the TrimUI Smart Pro. I don't think there's a big enough gap from this device to those other ones to warrant that $70 plus shipping. And so unless you're a collector and you pick these things up specifically as a hobby, I would say that it's probably better to wait until there's a clearer difference between the device you already have and the one that we're talking about today. And then finally, the second asterisk I have is that even though $70 plus shipping is a reasonable price for everything that you're getting with this device, if you just wait a few months, it's actually going to be a lot lower. This is a trend that we've seen specifically with these Anbernic devices over the past year or so. It'll come out at a reasonable price, but then somehow down the line, once it gets to those third-party distributors, they start trying to undercut Anbernic's prices, and all of a sudden it's going to be a good $20 cheaper than Anbernic is selling it. My guess is that within the next couple months on AliExpress, we'll see this device available between $50 and $60 with free shipping on sale. So if you're willing to just wait a little bit, you'll probably get an even better deal than this one right now. And if you wait a couple other months, you'll probably see 2 or 3 new Anbernic devices coming out, and maybe one of those will be a better fit for you. It's always better to wait if you're not in a big hurry to be able to pick up a handheld. And so really that's about it for this video. I just wanted to make the point that yes, it's a good handheld, and I think if you're just picking up your very first handheld focused on retro gaming, this is an excellent choice. However, among all of the others that are out there, it may not be worth it just because there are so many other good deals right now. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are you picking the RG40XX H up, or are you in the market for something else, or maybe you're just going to stick with the handheld that you already have? As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful. We will see you next time. Happy gaming.